Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
At my 42nd birthday dinner, just as I leaned in to blow out the candles on a cake I didn't even want, my mother, sitting with her glass of dry white wine held like a trophy between her bony fingers, looked at me across the table and said, loud enough for the clinking of silverware to stop, "You've always been the disappointment." No build-up. No hesitation. Just those 6 words, slicing the room in half. And I didn't flinch. I didn't throw my napkin. I didn't storm out. I just stared at her for a long, full breath, then slowly blew out the candles one by one, each flicker snuffed like a part of my soul I'd long stopped caring to revive. Everyone else sat stiff, pretending to be shocked, as if they hadn't known this was coming, as if it wasn't the 100th time my mother had taken a moment meant for joy and twisted it into a performance of control. My sister Carrie, sitting across from me with her perfect curls and her pastel blouse that probably cost more than my entire week's groceries, gave me that fake-ass smile she's mastered over the years, the one that says, "I'm trying to help," but really means, "Please don't ruin this for Mom." My brother-in-law Jim cleared his throat, awkwardly pushing his chair back, suddenly very interested in the centerpiece of sad hydrangeas. My mother took another slow sip of wine, pleased with herself, as if she'd just shut down a business deal or won a tennis match. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand on that goddamn table and tell them everything I'd swallowed for decades, but instead I smiled. I smiled so big it hurt my jaw. And then I picked up my knife and started cutting the cake, one piece at a time, passing them out to everyone like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just publicly labeled me a lifelong failure. When you've been your family's scapegoat long enough, you stop bleeding when they cut you. You just nod, patch yourself up in the car on the ride home, and try not to cry until the shower's running. But this time, I didn't patch it up. I didn't cry. I went home and opened my laptop, started a document titled Unpaid Debts, and typed her name at the top of the list. I wasn't even sure what I meant by that yet. Revenge, closure, confrontation, I didn't know, but something in me had cracked that night, something deep and dormant that had quietly watched for years while my mother pinned every mistake, every discomfort, every ounce of family tension onto me like I was her own personal punching bag, her lifetime scapegoat. What makes a woman say that to her daughter at her birthday dinner, I don't know. Maybe because she knew she could. Maybe because she thought I'd just swallow it like always. Or maybe, and this is what kept me up most of the night afterward, maybe because she was scared. Scared that I'd finally stopped caring enough to play the role she'd assigned me. Scared that I'd stopped trying to win her love. Or worse, scared that I finally knew something she didn't want me to remember. Because here's the thing, when you grow up in a house built on lies, the cracks start showing eventually. And when one of those lies is about your father dying when you were 19, and your mother spent the next 2 decades letting you believe you were the reason he never came back, well, something in your gut stays twisted. You never get to untangle it until the day someone gives you a reason to. And that birthday dinner? That was my reason. Carrie texted me the next morning early, too early for a weekend. All it said was, "Call me. Mom looks like she's seen a ghost." That was it. No emojis, no follow-up. Just that single sentence that yanked my stomach sideways. I didn't call right away. I stared at the message for 10 minutes, reading it over and over, imagining what Mom might have seen, or remembered, or hallucinated. Because ghosts don't show up without a reason. Ghosts wait. Ghosts linger. Ghosts come when someone calls them, even if they don't know they're calling. I didn't sleep well that night. After the dinner, I went back to my place, a small second-floor rental in a converted house that still smells faintly of other people's lives, and sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing. The candles, her words, Carrie's fake concern, all of it spun like a slow ceiling fan in my mind. At some point, I poured myself a glass of red wine and opened an old photo album I hadn't touched in years. The cover was cracked, the leather peeling at the corners. Inside were snapshots of someone else's life, me in a Halloween costume when I was 7, standing next to Carrie dressed as a pumpkin, Dad with his arm around me at the lake, both of us grinning like idiots, Mom in the background. Always just a little out of frame. Always watching. The more I flipped through the pages, the more something began to gnaw at me, this nagging feeling that I had forgotten something important. A detail, a moment, maybe even a truth I'd buried so deep it no longer felt like mine. And maybe that's what she saw on my face as I blew out those candles. Maybe she recognized something in my eyes, something dangerous. Because the real reason she's always hated me isn't because I failed her. It's because I never fully surrendered. I never gave her the complete satisfaction of owning my guilt. And now? Now, I'm done playing. Something shifted that night. Something cracked open, and I felt it, deep and irreversible. My mother thinks she's seen a ghost. But the real ghost isn't some memory that floated up in her sleep. It's me. The version of me she buried years ago. The version of me that remembers things I wasn't supposed to. And for the first time in my life, I'm not scared of what that means. Because ghosts don't just haunt. Sometimes, they come back to finish what was started. The thing about silence, especially the kind that festers between mothers and daughters, is that it never really stays quiet. It builds like static in the background of everything, like a low hum under every conversation, every look, every carefully measured moment, and sooner or later, it begins to scream, even if no one opens their mouth. When I finally called Carrie back that morning, her voice came through thin and breathy, like she'd already said what she needed to and was hoping I wouldn't make her repeat it. She said Mom hadn't spoken more than a few words since the party, that she'd been locking her bedroom door, something she hadn't done in years, and that she kept wandering around the house like she was looking for something she lost a long time ago and just realized it was never coming back. I asked her what exactly she meant by "looks like she's seen a ghost," and Carrie went quiet for a second too long, that kind of pause you only hear from someone who knows more than they want to admit. Then she told me Mom had taken out an old photo album, the leather-bound one with Dad's initials pressed into the corner, and just sat at the kitchen table with it open, staring at one photo for over an hour. Not flipping through pages. Not crying. Just staring, like she was expecting it to move or speak or tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. Carrie wouldn't say which photo, only that it was from the summer before Dad died, when I was 19 and the whole house still pretended we were normal. I could tell by the way she said it that Carrie was nervous, not of me, but of the truth that might crawl out if we kept digging, and I realized, in that moment, she'd always known more than she let on. She wasn't innocent, not entirely. Maybe she hadn't participated in the things Mom said, but she hadn't stopped them either. And sometimes that kind of silence is worse than cruelty. Sometimes standing on the sidelines and watching someone get torn apart makes you just as guilty. After I hung up, I couldn't sit still. There was a burn under my skin, a restless energy I hadn't felt in years, the kind that only shows up when a lie is unraveling and your gut knows it before your brain does. I drove without thinking, just keys, jacket, coffee in a thermos, and my foot pressing harder on the gas than it should have. I ended up on the outskirts of town, near an old gas station with a diner next to it, the kind of place where the booths are sticky and the coffee tastes like burnt toast. And that's where I found Rick Parsons. Rick used to be one of my dad's closest friends. They'd played football together in high school, worked construction one summer, even tried to open a bait shop before my mom shut it down, calling it a stupid man project. I hadn't seen Rick in almost 20 years, but his name popped into my head that morning like someone had whispered it, and I knew I had to find him. He was sitting at the counter, stirring cream into his coffee with the kind of slowness that only men who've seen too much and said too little tend to have. He looked older, softer, but his eyes were the same, sharp, a little sad, and far too aware of everything around him. When I introduced myself, he looked at me for a long time, then nodded like he'd been waiting for me to show up. We sat in a booth near the window, and I didn't bother with pleasantries. I told him what my mother said at my birthday dinner, how she looked me dead in the face and said I was the disappointment, how she's been unraveling ever since, and how there's something big that I feel pressing against my ribs, trying to get out. Rick didn't interrupt, didn't try to soften it, didn't tell me I was overreacting. He just listened with the kind of patience that makes you feel like maybe you're not crazy after all. When I finally stopped talking, he leaned back, crossed his arms, and said something I didn't expect. He said, "You don't know what really happened, do you?" Not a question. More like a dare. I asked him what he meant, and he gave me this look, one part pity, one part warning, and said that after my dad died, he tried to come to the house to pay his respects, but my mom wouldn't let him past the porch. Said he was unwelcome, said my father had been unwell, said it was all too painful, and that dredging up the past wouldn't help anyone. But that wasn't what stuck with me. What stuck was when he said my dad had been staying with him off and on during those last few months, that things at home had been complicated, and that Frank, that's what Rick always called him, never Dad, had told him more than once he was afraid something was going to happen. Not that he was sick, not that he was suicidal, but that something bad was coming, and he wasn't sure who'd survive it. Rick said Frank looked tired, beaten down, but still hopeful. Still convinced that if he could just hold on a little longer, he could make things right, maybe even take me with him. That part hit like a punch to the throat. Take me with him. Why would he need to take me? Why didn't anyone ever say that? I asked Rick if my dad had ever talked about leaving for good, and Rick just nodded slowly and said, "He was trying to do the right thing, Aaron. He was trying to get you out of there." The ride home felt longer than it should have. I had a knot in my stomach and the first hints of something bitter clawing its way up my throat. All these years, I'd carried the guilt of that night, Dad dead at the bottom of the stairs, blood near his mouth, Mom screaming for me to call someone, and the unspoken truth that maybe I could have stopped it, maybe it was my fault, but now, for the first time, I started to wonder if the story I'd been told was only half the truth, if Mom's version was just a polished lie wrapped in grief and blame. And as the sunset burned orange over the trees, I found myself whispering something I didn't even know I still believed. I didn't kill him. She did. I didn't know if it was true yet, but I knew I was going to find out. There is a strange heaviness that settles into your chest when a memory you thought was long dead suddenly exhales back into your life, not like a gust of wind, but like the breath of something that never really left, something that's just been waiting in the walls. Silent and patient, until the moment you're finally tired enough, or angry enough, or reckless enough to hear it. That's exactly how it felt the moment I sat across from Doreen Lang, a probate lawyer I went to high school with, who now operates out of a narrow, beige office sandwiched between a strip mall nail salon and a payday loan joint that smells like old gum and desperation. I hadn't seen her in years, but I remembered she'd always had this no-bullshit attitude, the kind of woman who could turn a PTA meeting into a cross-examination if you looked at her sideways. And I figured if anyone was going to help me start digging through the legal wreckage of my father's past, it might as well be someone who already had a built-in radar for lies. I told her I was looking for any remaining documents tied to my father's estate, specifically his will, and when she asked me why, I lied and said I needed them for personal closure. She nodded like she didn't believe me but wasn't in the mood to press, and after 20 minutes of typing and sighing and waiting for some archaic government database to load, she leaned back in her chair and muttered, almost like she was talking to herself, "That's odd." I asked her what was odd, and she told me that according to the original will on file, my father had named me, not Judith, not Carrie, not even the family accountant, as the executor of his estate. Not just a beneficiary, but the executor, the one who was supposed to oversee the handling of everything he left behind, the house, the savings, the life insurance, all of it. Except that never happened. After his death, Mom took over everything. She cleared out his accounts, sold the fishing boat he loved, repainted the entire house, and never once mentioned that I had any legal role in any of it. I was 19, grieving, confused, and too worn down by years of being blamed for things I didn't do to ask questions. I just remember her saying, "It's all been taken care of," and back then I believed her, because believing otherwise would have meant admitting that she was capable of stealing something that wasn't hers, not just money or property, but the last connection I had to my father. Doreen dug further and found a second filing, dated 3 months after my dad's death, showing that a revised will had been submitted by Judith herself, with my name removed and replaced by hers as sole executor and primary beneficiary. There was no note, no attorney's signature, no witness listed, just a single-page statement with a barely legible signature that, even at a glance, looked suspiciously unlike my father's handwriting. Doreen looked up at me and said, "This smells like bullshit," and for the first time in years, I felt something like validation. I took a copy of both wills and drove straight to Carrie's place, which was as aggressively tidy and color-coordinated as always, filled with scented candles and framed quotes about gratitude and faith. I held the papers out to her and said, "Did you know about this?" She didn't take them at first. She just looked at them like they were burning, like touching them might somehow make her complicit in something she'd spent years trying to ignore. Eventually, she took them, read the top few lines, and whispered, "I thought," she said, "he didn't leave a will." I asked her again, point blank this time, if she'd known anything about Mom forging documents or hiding my father's intentions, and Carrie, who once lied for 3 months about breaking my Walkman when we were kids, finally admitted that she remembered hearing Mom on the phone late at night after the funeral, panicked, whispering something about making sure it all went to the right people. That phrase, "the right people," echoed in my ears like a shot. I asked Carrie, "And who exactly are the right people?" but she didn't answer. She just sat there, biting her thumbnail, eyes glued to a corner of the room that suddenly seemed more interesting than her sister holding proof that our mother may have committed fraud. Later that evening, after the sky turned the kind of pale gray that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath, I drove to my mother's house. I didn't warn her I was coming. I didn't give myself time to cool off or rehearse some diplomatic opening. I just walked through the door with both wills in my hand and tossed them onto her coffee table. She looked at them, then at me, then slowly picked them up like I'd handed her a snake, and as she read, I watched something hard and cold settle across her face, a mask she's worn for years whenever she's been caught, but still wants to pretend she's in control. When she looked up at me, her mouth twisted into that thin, superior smile she always used when she thought she had the upper hand, and she said, "You don't know what that man was capable of." I said, "No, but I know what you are," and for a moment, the smile cracked. Just a sliver. Just enough to see the fear behind it. I told her I had the originals, that I was planning to speak with a lawyer, and that I wasn't letting this go. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just leaned back into the couch, held the forged will in her lap like it was a confession she'd written for herself, and said softly, "You don't understand the kind of things he was involved in." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about greed. This wasn't just about control. There was something else, something darker, something she'd spent over 2 decades keeping buried, and now that I had started digging, she was terrified that the rest of it might finally come up with the dirt. I stood up, looked her dead in the eyes, and said, "You ruined everything I had with him," and she shot back, quick and venomous, "No. He ruined it the day he told you he was leaving." And for a second, the whole room tilted. He told me he was leaving? I had no memory of that. No moment where he said goodbye. No warning. Nothing. I turned toward the door, and she said one last thing before I left. "You were supposed to forget." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing those words over and over again, wondering what exactly it was I had forgotten, and how much longer I could live with the possibility that remembering it might destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. My past, and the man I'd spent my whole adult life mourning. Because maybe, just maybe, my father hadn't died because of what he did. Maybe he died because of what he knew. And maybe, finally, I was starting to know it too. There's something uniquely cruel about realizing that the version of the past you've carried with you, clutched like an old photograph, folded and creased by years of reimagining and trying to forget, is nothing more than a carefully planted story. A false memory slipped into your pocket by the very people who claimed to love you. After I left my mother's house with her words, "You were supposed to forget," still clawing at the inside of my skull like nails on the underside of a coffin lid, I felt something shift deep in my gut. Not like fear, not like rage either, but a colder, quieter sensation that told me the ground under my feet wasn't just cracking, it had already caved in, and I was just now noticing that I'd been falling for years. I spent the next 2 days searching through the remnants of my father's life, or rather, what little of it I had managed to salvage from the boxes my mother had shoved into the back of our garage all those years ago after his death. when she seemed to be in a mad rush to erase any physical trace of him before the dirt on his grave had even settled. Most of it was junk, old receipts, some pocket knives, Polaroids with the colors fading and curling at the edges, but buried inside a metal toolbox, beneath a false bottom lined with duct tape and rust, I found a VHS tape with a strip of masking tape on the front and my father's initials, FL, scrawled in thick, uneven black marker. There was no label, no date, no explanation, just that unmistakable penmanship that looked like it had been written by someone in a hurry or under pressure, and the moment I held it in my hands, I felt my heart start to beat in that heavy, panicked way you only experience when you're on the edge of something. Irreversible. I don't own a VCR. I haven't for years. But there's a small video transfer shop on the other side of town run by a man who smells like dust and wears the same blue flannel shirt every day, who converts old tapes to digital files for people desperate to hear their dead parents' voices again or see their kids when they were small enough to hold in one arm. I brought the tape in, said I didn't care how long it took or what it cost, just that I wanted it done discreetly, and the man didn't ask questions. He handed me a receipt, said he'd call when it was ready, and as I stepped back into the sunlit parking lot, I felt like I had just given away a piece of something sacred or dangerous. Maybe both. When the file was ready 3 days later, I waited until night to watch it, alone in my apartment with the lights dimmed and my phone on silent. It began like any ordinary home video, my father holding the camera, chuckling as he fumbled with the focus, panning over our living room filled with mismatched furniture, tinsel still half hanging from the edges of a sagging Christmas tree, and my mother in the background yelling for him to turn that damn thing off and help clean up. I watched my younger self flash on screen briefly, 19, too thin, eyes darting everywhere, and then the camera dropped to the couch, clearly left running, forgotten or ignored, still capturing the audio even as the screen showed nothing but ceiling fan blades spinning in slow, hypnotic circles. And then it changed. The recording caught a fight, not just an argument, not just a tense moment, but a visceral, volatile eruption between my parents that seemed too raw, too rehearsed. Like something that had been happening for years, but had finally reached the point where neither of them cared who heard it anymore. My father's voice was slurred, tired, broken in a way I didn't remember, telling her that he was leaving, that he couldn't take it anymore, that he had made arrangements, that Aaron was coming with him whether she liked it or not. My mother's voice, sharp, commanding, almost panicked, cut through his words like a blade. She called him weak, a failure, a liar. She said she would never let me go, that I was hers, that he had no idea what he was doing, that if he thought he could just walk away clean, he was out of his goddamn mind. And then came the sound. Not a scream, not a cry, but a loud, sickening thud followed by the unmistakable crash of something or someone, hitting the floor hard, and then silence, stretched and eerie, as the camera kept recording, oblivious and steady. I sat there, frozen, my laptop glowing in the dark, my breath caught in my chest like I'd swallowed glass. I must have replayed that part a dozen times, hoping maybe the angle would shift, that something would become clearer, but the video never changed. The voices stayed the same. The impact always hit at the same moment. And no matter how many times I listened, it was unmistakable. My father hadn't simply died of a heart attack. He hadn't collapsed from stress. Something had happened. Something violent. Something she never thought would be recorded. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I just stared at the file on my screen, wondering how long she had known that this tape existed, wondering if she had been looking for it all these years, or if she had assumed he'd destroyed it. And then the next question followed like a whisper in the back of my mind. Did she know I had it now? By morning, my hands were shaking as I texted Carrie. I told her I had proof, actual, undeniable proof, that Dad's death hadn't happened the way Mom said. I didn't explain. I didn't send the video. I just told her to meet me alone. No mom, no kids, no distractions. I told her we needed to talk. Her response came quickly. Just a few words. Come to the lake house. I have something too. I stared at the message, heart pounding, and thought about how that lake house, our father's favorite place, The only place he ever seemed happy had always been a refuge, a place away from the noise and control and judgment that seemed to smother every room back at home. If Carrie had something to say, and she chose the lake house to say it, it meant it mattered. And after what I'd just seen, I knew one thing for sure. We weren't digging through memories anymore. We were digging up a body, one buried in silence, soaked in guilt, and wrapped in the kind of lies that fester for decades. And once you start uncovering that kind of truth, there's no way to stop. The lake house hadn't changed much, which in itself felt like some kind of trick my memory was playing on me, because while everything inside me had shifted, every belief, every version of my past I had once taken as gospel, this place stood there defiantly untouched, as if it had been sealed in glass the day my father died, preserved in silence and dust and the faint scent of old pine and rain-soaked wood. The gravel cracked under my tires in that familiar rhythm, the front steps creaked the same way they always had, and for a split second, as I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, I imagined my father on the other side of the door, sitting in his worn flannel shirt, feet propped up on the coffee table, a fishing magazine in his lap, and that crooked half-smile on his face that always meant he had a secret he wasn't ready to share just yet. But when the door opened, it was Carrie who stood there, smaller than I remembered somehow, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she wasn't cold, but trying to hold something in, something brittle and close to breaking. She didn't hug me. I didn't expect her to. Instead, she stepped aside without a word and led me inside, down the narrow hallway that always smelled faintly of mildew and lake water, and into the living room, where a single cardboard box sat on the floor between us like some cursed object neither of us wanted to touch first. I asked her if she was okay, and she nodded, but her eyes gave her away red-rimmed and hollow, like she'd been crying not just that day but for days on end. The kind of crying that doesn't come from sadness alone, but from the slow realization that everything you thought was true might be a carefully curated lie, delivered to you in pieces and polished with just enough love to keep you from asking too many questions. "I found them after he died," she said, her voice barely audible, like she was afraid the walls might still be listening. "I wasn't supposed to. I was looking for something else. I found the letters hidden behind a panel in the closet. She told me to leave it alone. She told me if I loved her, I'd burn them. I almost did." Then she reached into the box and pulled out a stack of envelopes, thick and yellowed with age, each one addressed in my father's neat, mechanical handwriting, the ink slightly smudged like he'd written them in a hurry, like his hands were shaking, like he didn't have time to write them the way he wanted. I took them one by one, opened them slowly, and read words that were never meant for Carrie, never meant for Mom, but for me, letters from motels and borrowed apartments, pages torn from notepads with hotel logos at the top, filled with apologies and explanations and promises that he was trying to find a way back to me. He wrote about legal meetings, about a lawyer named Harmon who had helped him draw up the original will, about court filings he was preparing to get custody of me, about how terrified he was that Mom would find out before he could finish what he started. He didn't call her abusive, not in those exact words, but the fear in his writing was unmistakable, lines that said he didn't trust her, that he didn't know what she was capable of, that if something happened to him, someone needed to know that it wasn't an accident. Each letter chipped away at the foundation I'd spent my life walking on, but the last one, the one dated just 5 days before he died, was the one that knocked the air from my lungs. In it, he wrote that he'd seen me looking at her differently, that he knew I was starting to understand things I didn't yet have words for, that if anything happened to him, he hoped I would keep asking questions, even if the answers hurt, even if they turned the world upside down. He ended it by writing, "I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. Don't let her convince you otherwise." When I finished reading, I couldn't speak. I just sat there holding the last page, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest like a second rib cage, a structure built entirely of grief and rage and bittersweet clarity. Carrie was crying now, openly, finally, and she said, "I was afraid. I was afraid that if I told you, she'd turn on me too." And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger toward her. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt something else, something quieter, sadder. I understood her fear because I had lived in it my whole life, but now that fear had turned into something else, something sharp and righteous and untamable. Back home, I didn't think. I didn't plan. I grabbed the flash drive with the digitized video, walked out of my apartment, and drove to my mother's house without so much as a text. I rang the doorbell and waited, not out of politeness, but because I wanted her to open the door. I wanted her to look me in the eye. When she saw me, she didn't ask why I was there. She just stepped aside and let me in, her expression unreadable, somewhere between resignation and that arrogant confidence she always wore when she thought she could still outmaneuver everyone in the room. I plugged the drive into her television without a word. I played the video. I let the whole thing run, from the cheerful fumbling with the camera to the fight to the silence after the crush. She didn't stop me. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stared at the screen, her wine glass in her hand trembling slightly, and when it ended, I turned to her and said, "I know what you did. I know why you did it. And now, so does Carrie." She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She just sat down slowly on the edge of the couch like her legs had given out under the weight of all the years she had kept this truth buried. And then, in a voice that didn't sound like hers anymore, she whispered, "You don't understand what you've started." I leaned in, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with the cold, undeniable satisfaction of someone who has just broken the last chain that ever held her, and said, "Oh, I understand. That's exactly why I started it." I walked out without looking back. I didn't need to see her reaction because I knew already. I knew that for the first time in decades, she wasn't in control. She wasn't the storyteller anymore. She was just another woman with a secret exposed, sitting alone in a quiet house, staring into the face of a ghost she created with her own hands. Because the truth is, I never haunted her. I never cursed her. I just survived her. And that, in the end, was the worst thing I could have done to a woman like Judith. What happens next, I don't know. I haven't decided. Maybe I take the letters and the video to the police. Maybe I go public. Or maybe I do something quieter, something that will last longer than scandal. Maybe I reclaim every part of my life she tried to erase, and I let the world see her not as the grieving widow or the misunderstood mother, but as she really is. A woman who destroyed a man and then spent 20 years blaming his daughter for not forgetting. Some people say revenge is loud and messy, a storm that leaves everything broken in its path. But sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just the look on someone's face when they realize the story they told all their life has finally been rewritten by the only person who truly lived it. And if you ask me, that's the kind of revenge that never fades. Because ghosts don't disappear. They remember.